Hey, comp covers. So, we are starting our third and final topic, which is sovereignty. And so, our first topic in sovereignty is going to be nation, state, regime, federal, or unitary power. In the AP CompGov curriculum, this is going to be topic 1.2 and 1.7. Let me kind of just differentiate between all of these words. Sometimes locally we don't use these terms correctly. Like, for example, oftentimes people talk about state and government and interchange those terms. Technically, they are different. In the United States, we call states like, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana as states. But again, in political science, there is different meanings to that term. So let me go ahead and differentiate between all of these. So the big umbrella term for basically any kind of political system is political system. So it's the umbrella term. It encompasses government, it encompasses nations, states, regimes, right? It's the big umbrella topic. And it comprises all the laws, all the ideas, the beliefs, the political culture, the procedures that address who should have authority to rule and what the government's influence on its people and economy should be. So it's an all encompassing term, right? You really can't go too wrong when you use political system because it encompasses everything from who makes the laws to who rules to who's in the executive, legislative, judicial. All of this comprises political system. So it's the big umbrella term. All right, government. Government is institutions. All right, and that's what you need to remember to differentiate between those. Government is institutions empowered to make decisions, right, for the people. So it's an institution. Sometimes it's a set of institutions, like legislative branch, judicial branch, and executive, or, the three branches. I forget which ones I mentioned. So it is institutions empowered to make decisions. A government's authority is derived from the state's legitimate right to use power. So if the people have conferred upon the government the power, then that government is legitimate and people follow the rules and the government makes the rules, right? It's an institution. The right and power to govern itself without outside interference is a crucial aspect of a state's sovereignty. So, as long as that government is indeed governing the people and the people are listening to the government, there's no outside sources, right, that are arbitrarily controlling that government, then that government has sovereignty, the power. Remember, sovereignty means power. So a sovereign state has independent legal authority. They're not being controlled by another institution. They are indeed powerful and independent. That's sovereignty, state sovereignty. Okay, so government is the institution, and a government is legitimate when the people feel like that government has legitimate power. And if it is truly an independent state, then it is a sovereign state. All right, regime. Regime is a part of a political system, and it's usually associated with either a democratic regime or an authoritarian regime. So it's the fundamental rules that control power, right? So is the fundamental rule democracy, where the people have a voice, or is the fundamental rules of control over power vested in an individual, an authoritarian regime, right? So fundamental rules that control power. Where is power vested? If it's in the people, then it's a democratic regime. If it's in a dictator, then it's an authoritarian regime. So regimes typically endure from government to government. So whether you may have a change in leadership, but it's still a democracy. Or you may have a change in the dictator, from one dictator to the next, but it's still an authoritarian regime, right? So regimes can endure from government to government. So when governments might change, like we may go from a parliamentary system to a presidential system, right? That may be a change in government, but if it's still democratic, then it's the same regime. All right. A nation. The nation is basically the people, right? It's a group of people with commonalities that include race, religion, language, ethnicity, political culture, political identity. So it's just a group of people. The people that make up um, a state. So let's talk about states. A state technically combines nation with government, right? It combines nation with government. So when a nation is being governed by a set of institutions that are empowered to make decisions, then that whole system, the nation and the government, make up what is known as a state, right? So the difference between government and state is that state includes the people, right? The nation. Government is just that, the institution. The state is the institution plus the people, right? So that is the state. All right, hopefully that clarified some of the differences between all of these terms. All right, 1.7 is federal versus unitary systems. So 3 of our countries are federal states, 3 of our countries are unitary states. So federal state, this is where power is divided among different levels of government. So the local, state, and national level. And we're familiar with this because in the United States, we are a federal system, right? We are a federal state. Mexico, Nigeria, and Russia are all technically federal states. Now, some of them, have little asterisks next to them, and we'll get into that when we get into the case studies. But they're technically federal states, which is defined by a separation of powers among different levels of government. But there is, and realize that in any federal system, that power does get reserved for to the national government as well, right? So sometimes a federal state can have power, uh, can have power more towards the national level, but it's still a federal state, right? So there are degrees of the amount of power the national government has under a federal state system. Unitary states. A unitary state concentrates power at the national level, so that we have a centralization of power at the national level, and the political system has been built that way purposefully. Sometimes it's built into the Constitution, sometimes it's built into traditions. But 3 of our countries are unitary states: China, Iran, and the UK. And so they concentrate and purposefully and intentionally centralize or concentrate power at the national level. Now, what is the advantage of a unitary state? Because it seems like it could be leaning towards authoritarianism. Well, the advantage is that it's a more efficient system. Look at the UK. The UK is very much a liberal democracy. It's not an authoritarian regime. It is a democratic regime. However, because of their system, right? The Westminster model, where it's a parliamentary system where power is definitely concentrated in the House of Commons, right, in London, and the majority party basically makes the agenda and passes legislation on its own agenda. It's a very efficient system, right? It gets things done a lot quicker than perhaps at a under a federal system. All right, so the degree to which power is centralized or decentralized can change over time. So sometimes, whether we're talking about a federal state or a unitary state, sometimes power can shift from being more centralized to more the opposite, decentralized. Decentralized means power is devolved down to state and local governments, right? Whereas opposed to centralized means concentrated at the national level. So power can change over time in both federal and unitary states. And if that's a little confusing to you, look at our case studies are going to hopefully clarify that for you. So examples tend to help understand what I'm talking about. All All right, and of course, there's also supranational organizations. And so, supranational organizations are organizations that various different states can subscribe to. So, like the UK used to be part of the European Union. The European Union is a supranational organization. The United States is a member of the UN. The UN, the United Nations, is a supranational organization. Um, Nigeria is a member of ECOWAS, which is an African version of the EU. So they are a member, and that is ECOWAS is a supranational organization. All right, and so sometimes this interferes with sovereignty, right? That's one of the reasons why the UK decided to leave the European Union, because the European Union seemed to have a little more sovereignty than the House of Commons. Okay, so let's now go to our case studies. So in the UK, its regime is a democracy, also known as a liberal democracy, because it does have free and fair and competitive elections, and individual rights are protected, and the rule of law is upheld. And that's all part of liberal. It's the liberal part of democracy. So another word for liberal democracy is substantive democracy. So a substantive democracy is also a liberal democracy, but we're more familiar with the liberal democracy term. That's the one I'm going to use. But if you see substantive democracy, that's what that means. All right, it's government. It's government. So what are the institutions that make decisions for the nation? It is a parliamentary system, also known as a Westminster model, because Westminster is the building that Parliament sits in, the House of Commons, House of Lords. So it's a parliamentary system. And what does that mean? It means it has a prime minister, right? And they have, in the case of the UK, a bicameral legislature, although power is definitely more invested in the House of Commons than the House of Lords. So it's a parliamentary system where the prime minister is head of government, right? Not head of state. All right, the UK is the state, right? As a matter of fact, the state is called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and it administers over 3 nations. Nations include England, Scotland, and Wales. Remember, England, they're ethnically unified. Scotland are Scottish. Wales are Welsh, right? England is English. So those nations. So Great Britain is the island nation, which was somewhat autonomous, has somewhat autonomous regions. England, Scotland, Wales are not independent countries. These are nations, not independent countries. And together, they make up the state of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is largely English. Okay, so the UK remains a unitary state, right? It is a unitary state with all constitutional authority belonging to the central government. When I say that, there's a term called parliamentary sovereignty that is unique to the UK. And that means that it has essentially, Parliament has judicial review, right? That power lies in Parliament, and no other institution can overturn Parliament. So parliamentary sovereignty, if there's a question about the constitutionality, then Parliament has the right to determine whether it is constitutional or not constitutional. So the parliamentary system, power is centralized in London, right? But devolved powers to regional governments. So even though power ultimately lies in London, in the Westminster model and the House of Commons, it does have something known as devolution. Devolution is giving some degree of power, some degree of local power to other nations. For example, Scotland and Wales have their own parliaments, right? But ultimately, the House of Commons prevails over any other parliament, whether it's the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Parliament, or the Northern Ireland Assembly, right? That's a technical name. The House of Commons is supreme. So it is a unitary system, but with devolution, right? And that's the technical term for the UK. All right, let's go to Russia. So Russia is not like the UK. Russia has an authoritarian regime. We've often referred to it as an illiberal democracy because, according to its constitution, it does technically have a democracy, but as we know, it's illiberal. They do not have free and fair and competitive elections. And individual rights are often suppressed. So it's an illiberal democracy and increasingly becoming an authoritarian regime. And we've been seeing this, as we all know, lately Putin has just passed some, or has encouraged the Duma and the Federal Council to pass constitutional changes that essentially give him more power. Okay, the nation of Russia is Russian. They are about 80% Russian, and as a result, they are considered a nation. They do have a similar cultural history, going back to, right, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, all of the Alexanders, right, history of an autocratic rule, so they have a shared history. The state is the Russian Federation. That's the technical name of Russia, and as a result, yes, they are a federal system with 83 local governments, but it is also highly centralized. Now, what do I mean? Yes, they do have local governments. Each of these 83 regions within Russia have governors, right? They have legislatures. So it is technically a federal system. But what we've been seeing under Putin is that it's becoming highly centralized. An example of this is the governors. So it used to be, before Putin made the changes, it used to be that the Federal Council, which is the upper house of the legislature in Russia, was comprised of regional governors and leaders. But then Putin changed this, ending this practice, and now the regional governors appoint members to the Federation Council. So the regionals appoint members to the Federation Council, and Putin now appoints the regional governors. Therefore, the political leaders in the Federation Council are not democratically elected or independent of the national government, because essentially Putin indirectly appoints them, right? So as a result, we have a highly centralized, although federal system. In addition, this is the second thing Putin has done to centralize power, even though it's a federal system. Putin cracked down on the regionalism with the creation of 7 super districts. So I don't know if you could see the bottom map right there. Back in 2000, Putin basically took all of the various different provinces, you can kind of see them here up in the top map, and consolidated them into 7 super districts. Each district is headed by a presidential appointee who supervises the local authorities as Putin sees fit. So there's another layer of how Putin controls all of the various different provinces within Russia by lumping them into 7 super districts, and he appoints those executives. Okay. Now let's go to China. China is an authoritarian regime. There are no presidential term limits, evidencing the authoritarianism. The Chinese Communist Party is definitively a vanguard party, which means that they operate in technically what is in the best interest of the people, not according to what the people want. So, an authoritarian regime. The nation is made up mostly of Han. It's an ethnic group. And most live along the east coast of China. 90% of China is Han. And it's another nationalistic thing is that it is known as the Middle Kingdom, and the Middle Kingdom meaning it is the center of everything. And so this is very nationalistic, and there's a lot of pride associated with it. All right, the state. The state technically is the People's Republic of China with 22 provinces and 4 municipalities. But what is important about this is that there are 5 autonomous regions that are ethnically based. So if you're not Han, then chances are your ethnic group, like the Tibetans, live in the Tibetan Autonomous Region. You can see here, I'm pointing to it right here. Or if you're a Uyghur, you would live in the Xinjiang Autonomous Region. So these autonomous regions tend to be ethnically based. There are also 2 special administrative regions. This is also very important. And why they're special administrative regions is because they've been given a little more autonomy. Look at Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a special administrative region, and they technically have a different government than China. And, there is ongoing tension between Hong Kong and China as a result of the fallout of that. It is a unitary system with devolution, like the UK. So China and the UK are similar in this regard. And the reason why we're seeing devolution in China is because to administer over 1.3 billion people is difficult. So there has been some power given to local provinces. So there is some degree of devolution in this unitary state. So economic decisions, for example, is devolved to subnational governments. These are more local governments, but central power retains in the national level, and the national government has a right to intervene. An example of this is Hong Kong. China will intervene in Hong Kong's affair and has, which is the source of all the tension and protests. All right, Mexico. So Mexico is a transitional liberal democracy. So it used to be authoritarian under the PRI or PRI, and has become increasingly since 2000 more democratic, more liberal democratic, struggling and to a large extent having some success in free and fair and competitive elections. So it is a transitional liberal democracy coming from an authoritarian history. The nation, Spanish speaking mestizos, which is a blend of Spanish and indigenous. They do have a pretty large indigenous population as well. And again, they have the shared history of colonization by Spain, so they are a nation. The state is the United Mexican States, and yes, it is a federal system. It has traditionally been a weak state, but it is transitioning to a strong state. It's still struggling, drug cartels being one of its biggest obstacles. So, as a federal system, it does have states, as how we talk about states, the United States, as in Sonora, the state of Sonora, the state of Chiapas, right? So, they do have these 31 various states and a federal district in Mexico City. And each of these states have governors and unicameral legislatures. And again, power used to be very centralized, but the collapse, not collapse, I guess the lessening of the power of the PRI, centralization is being challenged. Nigeria. So Nigeria is also, much like Mexico, a transitional democracy. It has gone from it's alternated basically from an authoritarian in the first, second, and third republics to an illiberal democracy in the fourth republic, but is under Buhari trying to transition to a more liberal democracy. It has had some elections, free, fair, competitive elections, but they've also been criticized as maybe they're not so free and fair. But they're transitioning, they're trying. The nation, this one's controversial. Nigeria has a question associated with this nationalism because it's such a diverse country. And remember, the country's borders were created by the British, right? European colonization. So a bunch of ethnic groups are kind of thrown together, including the northern Hussein Fulani, who are Muslim. In the middle, you have the Yoruba, and the Hussein Fulani kind of mixed up. And in the south, you have the Yoruba animists and Christians, as well as the Igbo, who are also animists and Christians. So that's just four of the major ethnic groups. There are a lot more ethnic groups associated with Nigeria. And because of that, they have trouble nation building. So they have a national question. Should they remain a united country, or much like we saw in the Biafran Civil War and the idea of secession, right? So this is a national question. The state, it's the Federal Republic of Nigeria with 36 states and one territory, and that's Abuja, which is the capital city. It does alternate between failed state and weak state. It's currently a weak state because the people do not have a whole lot of confidence in their government, so they have a legitimacy question. And it's largely because it has such a strong history of patrimonialism. Patrimonialism is a pattern of state society relations, so the government and the society, the nation's relationship, in which elites, these are usually the ruling people, do not distinguish between personal and public relations. So they take public money. They treat the country as if it belonged to them. That's a patrimonial state. So because of that, it is a weak state, and a history of authoritarian regime. So it's got a federal political system in theory. Each of the 36 states do have executive, legislative, and judicial branches, but currently neither federalism nor checks and balances operate because of problems associated with trying to establish a fragile democracy. All right, last but not least, let's go to Iran. So, Iran is an authoritarian state. Rulers are not regularly accountable to the public through elections and therefore need not fully respect rights or rule of law. It is also a theocratic state. It's a political system in which religious law is supreme, and in this case, that is Sharia law. It has a strong sense of nation, Persian, with that speak Farsi and have a long history of subscribing to Islam. Right, Islam is a unifying factor within Iran. Not to mention the fact Shia Muslims, right? Shia Islam is a unifying factor within Iran. The state is the Islamic Republic of Iran, which was established in 1979 with the revolution. It's a strong state, 31 provinces, and it is highly centralized, unitary state. So here is our definitively highly centralized unitary state. It does have administrative separation into provinces, districts, and localities, but none of them really have executives or legislatures. So it is a highly centralized unitary state. All right, guys, we'll come back with our next topic tomorrow. Stay safe.